training. Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
All right, everybody out there, good afternoon to the Team Krulak community. My name is Major Ian Brown. I'm the Operations Officer at the Krulak Center, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Brew Krulak Center for Innovation and Creativity, welcome to the Brewcast. This is the first in a series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and professional military education with the best in innovative and creative thought. Before we begin, just a couple of admin notes. First, I'd like to remind everyone that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and don't reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. We'll also be recording this webcast for the benefit of those in the community who can't join us today. So we ask you to be mindful. If you have not already, please turn your microphones off, put them on mute to avoid any disruptions to the presentation. And as well, if you could turn off your cameras just to help us preserve bandwidth so we have a clean transmission. For our inaugural Brewcast, we're excited to present Dr. Christopher C. Harmon, who is our Donald Bren Chair of Great Power Competition here at the Krulak Center. Before assuming duties as a Bren Chair, Dr. Harmon was a course director at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii. He's also worked as a professor of international relations at Marine Corps University. He's taught strategy at the Naval War College and has worked on foreign affairs for the House of Representatives. His previous publications include lead editor for Toward a Grand Strategy Against Terrorism, published by McGraw-Hill. He's author of Innovation and Historical Continuity in Great Power Competition in the fall 2019 issue of the Marine Corps University Journal, and also author of Iran as Competitor, Measured, Violent, Relentless, a paper published on the Krulak Center website in May 2019. The topic of today's Brewcast is a focus on Asia, how terrorist groups end. Before we start, just one last reminder to please have your microphones and cameras off if you have not already done so. We will have a question and answer session at the end of Dr. Harmon's presentation. So if you have a question as we're going along that you'd like him to address at the end, just go ahead and type it in the group chat and I'll use that as the reference and try and get to as many as I can at the conclusion of Dr. Harmon's presentation. And with that, Dr. Harmon, over to you.
Thank you, Major Brown, and welcome everyone. Hope you're all well. Thanks for your time this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm delighted to be with you. I'm asking the question today: how and why do terrorist groups end? And this is interesting in security studies because we want to understand well any group that's a trouble to us. And we want to understand larger ramifications in the region, so we study the groups themselves. It's interesting in strategy because most of us want to see the decline or suppression of terrorist groups if we have that opportunity. For those reasons and just curiosity, I began doing this work back when I was at Command and Staff College and developing a strategy course. I really felt that the war termination package we had was good, but that in low intensity conflict, we were not looking at how and why insurgencies and terror groups end. And I should say in passing, I'll be speaking of insurgencies frequently. When they systematically and deliberately use terrorism, they meet the definition that I use. And we can talk later, if you like, about more definitions. So from 03, 04, or 05 onward, I was publishing and lecturing on the subject, but usually it did not have a focus on Asia, and that's where I want to turn now. The first way, and I'll explore 5 of the ways I've seen terror groups end. The first of them is defeat by good grand strategy. The Command and Staff College and School of Advanced Warfighting and a lot of other schools have often done Filipino case studies in which the post-World War II era is opened up with an eye to the Hukbalahap. This was a group that was communist. At the time, no division between the Stalinists and the Maoists yet, if you like, that was fixed. And they hoped to transform what was a new republic, getting its start as a constitutional democracy, into a communist state. They were well led, and in fact, the leader, Louis Turuk, would carry on until his surrender at the date you see there on the slide. They were resisted by a government which was clever and wise at the same time. Ramon Magsaysay was Secretary of Defense. He then became president. He had terrific allies like Edward Lansdale, one of our OSS veterans who was in CIA by this time. And they approached the problem with a grand strategy in mind. So they knew that for the Filipinos, free and fair elections was a key thing. It would be for any democracy. And they set about developing the mechanisms to try to assure the security of that kind of election. They'd been foul things before, and they got cleaned up, and it was an impressive change. And in fact, some of the mechanisms constitutionally they used to do that, to help with the elections, are still in practice in the Philippines when they do elections today. They knew civil-military relations were very poor with the armed services. So they were not only rebuilding the armed services and making them work well with police, they revamped their approach to many things. They became very good at intelligence. They became very good at civic action. And the Philippine Army under Magsaysay began to do extremely good work in counterinsurgency, with great expertise in terms of focused small unit operations and other things. On the basis of the economics, they were thoughtful. They knew that the Hukbalahap were claiming that the major reason for their rebellion was to get land for the landless. So they set about attacking that problem. They had a program they called EDCOR. It wasn't small, but it was important, and it worked. And it took folks who had defected from the Hukbalahap and gave them the chance, when they could prove they were clean, to have a parcel of land in an area that was had been virgin and was now administered by the state and electrified and so forth, and they could get that piece of land that they'd pined for. So those are examples of how they took a large approach, a broad approach, and did a beautiful job with it. So Louis Turuk comes in out of the field.
Yeah, I mean,
eventually, he's simply worn out from the effort, and he's unable to defeat a group that's not much discussed, but very important, a large group in the northeast of India, in the Punjab. Many of you remember from your history a conflict at Amritsar. There was one in 1919 that was infamous. Sikhs wanted more autonomy from New Delhi, and they fought for that, and they fought for it under a conception of a land of the pure, or Khalistan. And they developed both insurgency and terror tactics to fight for that. And they didn't have broad support in India, but they had some within the Punjab. It was a kind of national and religious liberation effort, if you like, with a variety of named groups. Well, this led to their occupation of the famous Golden Temple in Amritsar in 1984. And when the Army of India took it back, it was done with brutality and aggressiveness, and there was artillery involved. It was not a very clean internal effort that any state is happy to make, especially a liberal democracy like India. So it didn't go well, even though the head of the rebellion was killed on the spot. They tried to do better 4 years later when they had another crisis, and that was in '88. And this time the lead was not military but police, and it was a man named KPS Gill, Gill, who's quite famous in India for the success that he had. He took a more careful and modest approach, but also was very much willing to use force. He did other things, and the Indians did other things that make it a real study in grand strategy, because they are going to win about 1995. They passed emergency legislation, which allowed detention without trial for some considerable period. They did much, much better work on intelligence than had been before that in the early 80s. For example, using former terrorists and other tricks that a good intelligence organization would have. The police did very well. They were professional. The Army served well, mostly outside in the countryside with various missions there. Many of the police were Sikhs themselves from Punjab, and so that helped with this alienation factor we often encounter in counterinsurgency. They fenced the borders, which prevented some overflow from Pakistan. They used militias, and they favored a moderate Sikh political party. When I looked once at how the Basque group was broken in Spain, this proved to be one of the three keys to that victory by the government. In this case, in the Punjab, they supported moderate Sikh political actors who then were an alternative to the terrorist movement, and that gave credibility to New Delhi and Gandhi, and it led to a diminution of political support for the Sikh terrorists in the Punjab. So by 95, KPS Gill leaves the police head job, and most of the terrorism's been left behind, and we haven't seen that kind of trouble in the Punjab ever since. Ian, we'll turn now to the second way that terror groups have often been defeated. Social studies folks don't always like to talk about this, but the truth is defeat by force has been more common than we would all prefer. Defeat by force, whether police or military, has been a common way that many terror groups have ended. And I'm going to talk about several in Asia, and the first is really unknown to us now. We tend to forget about it. The People's Liberation Front, a strange combination in Sri Lanka of Sinhalese ethnics, Maoism, and nationalism. In effect, they wanted to enlarge the power they held as Sinhalese dominating in the south and west in Sri Lanka. They already had a lot of power and they wanted to maximize it. We sometimes hear of terrorists as always representing the underdog. This is the opposite. This is a group that has great power and wants to increase it and is willing to be terribly brutal about it. JVP in Sri Lanka begins in the late 60s. They do an insurrection about 1971. It does not go particularly well, and the leader named Wijawira, Rohan Wijawira, is arrested and goes to jail. So things go quiet for a while. But the issue's not over. And there were great tensions and problems from about 83 onward in Sri Lanka between Tamils and Sinhalese, as you probably know. And this would give rise to the Tamil Tigers. And at this time, the Sinhalese make a revival of JVP. They go back into the fight and begin using widespread terrorism. It's an insurrection, it's an insurgency, and its use of terrorism is rampant. It's pretty appalling how many people die in this phase of Sri Lanka's period. Well, they finally caught Wijawira in a good operation by security forces, although he was perhaps killed in custody very shortly. But they did take him, and with him they took one of the last men at liberty who was in the Politburo of the JVP. And so this bizarre nationalist Maoist fusion group ends up defeated entirely by 1989 by Sri Lankan authorities. Imagine at the same time wrestling in your country with a totally different insurgency. So while the Sinhalese are doing their business in the south, up north and in the east, Sri Lanka faced another insurgency by the famous Tamil Tigers, led by Vellupillai Prabhakaran. He was ruthless. He was deadly serious about an entirely independent country. He killed many moderate Tamils, not just Sinhalese, and government people. The fight had various periods and included a large supply of aid from India, But they were also highly skilled in logistics and armaments manufacture, and they managed to arm themselves and be a highly, highly successful insurgency. Moreover, they did what a great scholar at NDU, Tom Marks, often talks about. They created a sort of shadow government, or a counter state, as Marx likes to say. That is to say, in the areas that they control, the LTT would give you an internal visa if you wanted to go from one town to another. They would tell you who your school teacher was going to be. They would tax your fisheries operation or your rice crop as it came in, or your business. They administered. They were proving to themselves and to other Tamils that they could govern, not just destroy. So there are large swaths of eastern Sri Lanka and northern Sri Lanka that were gradually overtaken by these people. The Indians were so shocked, they sent a peacekeeping force over, and it did not do well because LTTE was a very proficient insurgent army by then. Their range of weaponry alone was amazing. They had a nascent air force, they had a navy, and so forth. Well, this was defeated by a systematic and somewhat conventional effort. That is, Sri Lankan authorities made war on LTTE with divisions, with task forces, with air and artillery. They gradually forced these insurgents, who were using lots of Tamil human shields, into a spot in the north and utterly destroyed them. It was an ugly finish to an ugly war. And the UN and others were very critical of how the Sri Lankan authorities did it. But what you can say by 2009 is that not just once, but 2 times, Sri Lankan authorities defeated insurgencies within their country. There are other examples of this. The Japanese Red Army is fascinating. It's one of those groups that was led by a woman. There are very few of those, named Fusako Shigenobu. She was a terrorist. She had Marxist-Leninist ideas and can still be found on YouTube spouting those off. She had a base in Lebanon and so forth. It was an international Marxist-Leninist group, and it was broken by systematic arrests and by the capture of Shigenobu. The other case I mentioned there on the slide is Shinrikyo, about which you probably know a great deal. Mass arrests occurred and broke that group's power after its sarin gas attack. Well, we now go on to a third category, and decapitation is one of these things which every counter-terrorist or counterinsurgency would hope can happen, but it's, of course, extremely difficult to do, isn't it? And there aren't many cases in Asia. There aren't. So one that's fascinating and deals with Chinese thought, Maoism, is Peru, because it was transplanted to Peru by a man with 2 PhDs who helped run a university, who brought it in with the idea that the peasantry in Peru looked a great deal to him like the peasantry in China, and that this method of revolution could transform what he thought to be an inadequate capitalist and democratic system into something more helpful to his kinds of viewpoints. So insurgency begins very quietly in the 70s. There's an outburst of violence about 80, and that runs for 12 or 13 years, all the way until the capture of Abimael Guzman by a very smart national police officer who had a small office and good clean methods and good old-fashioned detective work. He did a remarkable job, and he was able to grab Guzman, who's still in jail now. Now, the other cases are equally interesting. The Kurdistan Workers' Party might have been a terrific case of decapitation. You'll remember that this nationalist and Marxist group did have its leader grabbed in Africa and rendered out of Africa by Turks. And he's in a jail now in Turkey and has been for all these years. But they did not totally control his access to his own people. And family and lawyers and message takers have come and gone. And Öcalan has continued to stay in touch and in power to a degree. The KWP or PKK is a hard group to study now because it's mixed in a bit with various Kurdish militias we've seen operating in Syria, a few even on our side of the fence. But PKK continues, and the Turks say that from 15, 16 onward, they've continued to practice violence. PKK violence used to be famous all across Europe. And in fact, they were the ones who did those simultaneous attacks that we sometimes attribute now to Al-Qaeda's invention. You would wake up in the morning in Berlin or someplace, and you would see 4 or 5 different hotspots on the news across Europe where the Kurdistan Worker Party had struck. So more to follow on them. The leader remains in jail. Decapitation was possible, but was not effected by the Turks. I leave it to discussion to talk about Islamic State. There's a terrific argument to be made that the Trump administration's latest victory there against al-Baghdadi was incredibly important. You'll find me arguing that when a man designates himself as caliph, he has taken a position in the hierarchy of a group, which is unusual and which is very demanding. And when that man is killed, I think it's incredibly important. It's more important a death than catching and killing bin Laden, in my view. On the other hand, if you ask me, well, did we just decapitate ISIS? I would say no. Like you would point to all the other aspects of grand strategy, which were so important to taking down that state, that proto-state. So it's a fascinating case, and it fits only uneasily in with the area of decapitation. We'll move now to the next sort of category where I've traditionally done work, and that's what I call a transition into Pacific politics. Now, I've seen articles in the last 10 years that amuse me a bit because they make it seem like this is the most common solution to terrorism. Well, it's the most delightful, but it doesn't happen half as often as people say. The transition into Pacific politics is not the norm. Terror groups, because of what they are, rarely morph into a democratic political party or even a semi-democratic political party. They do have political fronts, but that's not different than practicing democracy. That is different than practicing democracy. Now, there are some cases, and the Irish Republican Army is a terrific one, where this happens. And in Asia, I think here are 1 or 2 cases we could look at. Nepal's a mixed bag. When I lectured on Mao back in the late 90s at Command and Staff College, Quantico, I used to talk about the Nepalese Maoists. In 96, they began a full dress insurgency in their rural areas, and it was highly successful. In 10 years, they moved in on the capital and swamped democratic and royalist brands of politics and became a dominant force within the Kathmandu and other places. They now have merged, in effect, with a kind of republican form of government. So you have this odd fusion. The Maoists haven't come as far as they wanted. On the other hand, they certainly have not failed. And as we look at that country now, in 2008, the prime minister was Pushpa Kamal Dahal, who's the leader of the Nepalese Maoists. He turns from revolutionary into prime minister, running a parliamentary form of government in Nepal. Quite unusual. And yet his number 2, Bharam Bhattarai, who's a PhD in urban planning with an Indian doctorate, this Nepalese Maoist, the number 2 in the movement, also became prime minister. In fact, he served 2 terms. So they have somehow managed to make themselves appealing enough on Pacific levels to dominate government in Nepal for at least parts of the time. They remain fascinating to watch. The woman who's a president in Nepal now, I think, is a Marxist-Leninist, although not a Maoist. And again, our best source on this in English publications is often Dr. Tom Marks at NDU. For example, he released a paper April a year ago called Red on Red in Nepal, and Tom Marks in that discussed the ongoing pattern of violence in Nepal It has not ceased, even though they are in a dominating position at times in Parliament. The next group is Middle Eastern. People's Mujahideen is one that every American terrorist analyst used to worry about. You know, in the 70s, they attacked not only Shah targets and Iranian targets and American targets. They aspired to take over Iran, and their politics were somewhat ambiguous. But they regarded themselves as religious and nationalist, and now they regard themselves as secular and sometimes as feminist, if you like. It's quite surprising. The group was founded by a man, but his wife is now the leader of it, his second wife. Maryam Rajavi has done an amazing job politically of taking a group which was insurgents and terrorists and gradually morphing into a very political entity with offices in France, with open political offices other places, and with a posture that they oppose fundamentalism, they oppose the mullahs. All they want is nominally respectable and democratic governance in Iran, doubtless in which they have a central place. They're seen by some as very much a cult. They are today, and this is what's important here, they are today no longer listed by our Department of State under groups that direct terrorism. They're seen as pacific and political. PMOI is fascinating. The mysterious founder who disappeared, his poster just reappeared in Iran on one festival. But meanwhile, Maryam Rajavi is the director of the programs. She does the satellite broadcast. She helps produce books that they publish, of which I've read several. And PMOI remains an utterly fascinating entity. If you're interested in this publicity blitz they did with paid advertisements to get themselves off of our lists in the State Department, you can consider the chapter that I did on them in a book for Brookings in 2018. PMOI is a truly interesting organization. Now back to Asia and the Philippines, the New People's Army. They are not expected to transition to Pacific politics, but I put them here because that might happen. When Rodrigo Duterte became president in 2016, there was talk about whether an agreement with this Maoist organization could come to pass and whether perhaps Jose Maria Sison would come home from exile. They already have political fronts. They have a women's organization called Gabriela that competes openly in elections and does quite well. The National Democratic Front, which is their political side, competes very well in Filipino politics. So it is possible that they will in the future transition to Pacific politics, but believe me, they sure haven't done it yet. And the somewhere between 3,000, 3,500, 4,000 NPA guerrillas are still in the field. They're still inadequately armed. They're still fighting, and they're important in the Visayas, in Mindanao, and some other places in the country. It could be that the founder who's in Holland may die. It could be that he comes home. Any number of resolutions is possible, and I don't know what's coming. But until then, NPA remains a terror organization, an insurgency, and in fact, Duterte declared it to be, quote, terrorist in, I think, December of 2017. And now we turn to the end because, and there is a fifth way these things have ended, and it's not too cheery. I was standing in our Gray Research Library in Quantico a number of months back, and I had in my hands a new book from a very prestigious British press, and it was about terrorism, and I was amazed to read in this book by two authors that, quote, most terror groups really just decline and disappear, and what this means is that we ought not overreact to them. How comforting and how false. Groups do decline and sometimes disappear, usually because they are resisted in any number of ways, like some of those we've discussed. Sometimes they win outright, and that just shows us what the consequences are and why we can't really be half as complacent as those academics were. The first reminder, it goes back to the early 20th century. I mean, Lenin's Bolsheviks often denied they used terror, but that was silly because they used it all the time when it was useful to them and when the party controlled it. What bothered them was terrorism they could not control, like that by the anarchists or other rival groups. When they take over in 1917, yes, the 100 years in power was just recognized by Sison's Maoist, for example, and some major publicity a few years ago. So when they take over in 1917, they then conduct a fierce totalitarian form of government which continues to use terror. So they are pretty steady from about 1905 right through their entire episode of the 20th century for using terror. They approached it again based on the virtues of a coup, based on virtues of scattered terrorism to disorient a population. But when they got into power, they knew exactly how to deal with terrorists. There's a winning and vivid passage in The World Crisis by Winston Churchill, who explains that they had felt the rivalry of the anarchist terror movement in Russia up to the time of victory, and they had plans for dealing with that. They arrested and murdered most of the anarchists or left them in jail for many years. In short, they crushed the anarchism in the new Soviet Union with brutal uses of force. Now, one Middle East example that's really important because it was so instructive to the world was the National Liberation Front in Algeria. They had seen rebellion in their country periodically. They'd seen it suppressed by the French. They were determined upon a new approach, one which was much more directorial and dictatorial, and not relying so much on kind of collusion with other partners. They founded their front in the fall of '54, and they declared that this would be the sole representative of the Algerian people. And it was for a time in the underground, so that if you were, for example, a left-wing opponent of the government, you could join FLN, but you had to do that by joining. You couldn't keep your old party affiliation. If you were a communist cell, well-armed, and wanted to bring 35 terrific gunmen into the operation against France, you could, but you were forced by FLN to accept their governance, guidance, and you would be hereafter members of the National Liberation Front in Algeria. They were important as well for lots of other reasons, including their doctrinal genius, who was not Algerian, Frantz Fanon, who helped characterize violence and rebellion and terror in ways that were highly favorable for the government themselves. So they take a role then in government. When they win in '62, they embark on a one-party state, and in fact it held power in Algeria for decades, and they governed as a successful revolutionary group. And for us, who've seen the Battle of Algiers and maybe read Alistair Horn's book, A Savage War of Peace, and some of the other things, they're recognized as a very influential group that really made people in the post-World War II era see that nationalism could be powerful. So we've seen Marxism-Leninism, we've just now looked at nationalism, and we can look again back to Maoism for our third case, Khmer Rouge. This group doesn't get much discussion, but in the 70s and 80s, it tended to be dominant because they turned rural insurgency to a good effect and in terms of power grabbing. And they came to power in 1975 in Cambodia, and for 3 years plus were actually in power. They only lost power because the Vietnamese didn't like them and drove them out in 78 December. But the Khmer Rouge are still a worthy study for how an insurgency used politics and terror and human mobilization and many other things to gain authority in Cambodia. They had a great deal of help from the People's Republic of China, just like the Vietnamese communists did, and they were energetic and absolutely ruthless. And the Khmer Rouge remain an example of why terrorism is so important, because it can be victorious if it's not defeated in its growing phase. Will there be other groups that win? I'm disturbed sometimes by the news I see on Taliban. We may not choose to remember, but of course Taliban grew from an insurgency using terror to take over some 90% of Afghanistan. What we see now is Taliban the second time around, and the picture is not pretty. They're doing well. They're able to do fight and talk like any of the other successful groups we've studied. And so right now they're putting on the table not just proposals, but pistols. They continue to remain a group that's able to fight as well as to negotiate. And if the coalition does fully withdraw from Afghanistan, we could see a serious problem. The other thing I would say, besides thinking of other groups which are dangerous as Taliban, would be to consider a kind of category of, let's say, limited success. So in politics, not everything is a slam dunk. It isn't always like the Khmer Rouge that simply succeed in 1975. Groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, the PLO before them, are well worth studying in this area of how terror groups end, because many times what happens is they obtain a considerable amount of power, areas that they do govern or administer, or partially so. And they are a sort of strategic level limited success. So there is no fully national government for Palestine, but Hamas does control the territory that it has in Gaza, and that's not an easy problem. And they do compete well in considerations about prestige and legitimacy. Hezbollah has totally transformed Lebanon, has undermined its sovereignty, and is now a dominant or often the dominant political force in that country, which was a famous democracy at one period. So a notion of kind of success, but of a limited kind, something less than what the aspirants want, I think is useful as we think about how terrorist groups end.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.